Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Breaking Changes podcast. I'm your host and chief evangelist for Postman, Ken Lane. With Breaking Changes, we explore topics from the world of APIs, but through the lens of business and engineering leadership. Joining me today, we have Rosemary Missier. I learned a lot talking about the API lifecycle and governance with Rosemary, and I really enjoyed her flipping the tables on me and interviewing me for the remainder of the show. I always start with the basics. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm Rosemary, and I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I work with Samvit, and I've been working in various different roles, but most recently, I'm a PM consultant, but with a very strong technical background that goes down a decade. And I love software engineering still a software engineer at heart, but just trying to marry the engineering side and product world as well.
Yeah. So what does APIs mean in your world? How do you see the world of APIs?
Uh, Talking from my experience, it goes back to the days where I started off, writing web services, and it's just evolved. And today, I see it as two different things. There are companies that are API driven, and there are companies which, APIs are just part of their work. But I think it's become like a buzzword right now, where everyone has started looking into the values of APIs and trying to see how to monetize them, and how is it that we can share that knowledge across everyone, where you have different platforms. So I guess we are still early days in the API journey, if I may say so.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like all everything I go back to the SOA, the service oriented architecture days, web services. But I feel like the last 20 years have just kind of been practice for what's coming up. I feel like now everyone's awoke a little bit to what the potential is. But I'm hearing a lot of people talk about what's come before is very IT led. What's happening now needs to be product management, have more business stakeholders involved. Is that jive with how you see the world?
Yeah, I think I totally agree, but it depends on the organization as well. So I can say that when you are really venturing out into that API journey, it's a different world. The business gets more involved rather than the engineering team. And then it's altogether a different game, because you're getting strategy, marketing, all the different stakeholders there, trying to have those partnerships. So you're looking at it from a totally different angle rather than, the actual product, API product itself. But there are places where, that mindset is changing. You're having that API first mindset, and that's completely changing as well. From day one, you're starting to work very closely with your third party developers and partners, and trying to, work hand in glove with them and offer that support. So I think it's depending on where you are in that API journey. I think you can say it is heavily IT driven sometimes, and it is also the other way.
Yeah, I like that you use API journey because I feel like this is one of the distinct characteristics that different a lot of APIs I've seen over the years have been projects. Kind of once you're done,
Yes.
you kind of check that box and you're like, we're done. We did the API. And that's not how modern APIs are done. They're living, they're evolving, or they're sustained in sustain mode, or you're deprecating them and you're constantly moving things forward like that. So it's definitely a journey for people, and depending on the maturity, how they see the space, they're going to see things differently. And so are you what's what's the majority of APIs that you've worked with? Is it internal, is it partner, is it public, is it a mix of the three all working in concert?
I think I have touched, I would say, private, public, and hybrid. But just to go back to your previous point, sometimes, with the private APIs, you treat them as features, and rather than as a product. And that's where you get stuck, because sometimes they never get used, and you're just rushing to get this API out for a particular partner, which you do not see has value, and you start trying to add more to it, and it just goes nowhere, right? So, from my experience with private, public, and hybrid, I would say I think the ways of working are very different for public. You'd understand that as well. So you'll have this larger ecosystem of partners, and my way of working with them is completely different as opposed to where you're working with. I've also worked with but just on private APIs where you're just treating it as a project as well as a feature.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. What would you say? What would you say that do you see like a pattern where have you with the project related work that you've done, say on APIs, I'm sure you have done, where would you see that being treated as a project, on the private side, public, or is it like a pattern right across the different APIs?
Yeah, I mean it depends on the organization. I've seen a lot of government agencies do public APIs that were very project driven. They had a budget of kind of finite. We did the thing, and then now they're I'm hearing this phrase a lot. They're zombie APIs or zombie API portals.
Yeah.
They're there, but there's nobody home, and you can't. If it goes down, it may not ever come back up. But then I would say, if I had to say, like, what's the common, it's people, it's kind of a mix of maturity, is like from the inside out, is as APIs they begin as kind of microservices or just ad hoc APIs behind one mobile app or one web app or one system integration, and then it starts to get usage, it starts to get traction, and it's maybe getting a little bit more budget, a larger team, it matures, it hardens, then it starts, hey, we have a partner who wants it. Can we expose it to them?
Expose it.
And then it becomes more, partner program emerges, maybe it gets hung in a portal. And so that kind of outward facing maturity happens organically. But I think what a lot of companies I'm seeing are desiring is they want to strengthen that muscle and be able to do that confidently, like move API from idea to public external exposure confidently, securely, safely, all of that.
And I think that's exactly where product or business needs to step in, because when you're starting in that ideating journey, I think you need to see what is the value that you're getting in that API. You might start off just as an internal API for another team in your company, but you just never know. You might start exposing the data to an internal team, but then over time, you might then start exposing that to one partner, and then that could change your whole world, right? You might start. But then I've noticed that sometimes fundamental problems are different stakeholders don't get involved just when you're starting to create internal APIs. And actually, that's the fundamental problem, because you need to start at that point in time. The thinking starts right now before you end up in a way where you're having throwaway APIs just because you haven't thought. And I've been in situations like that, where you haven't thought that this could explode with time and you are going to have an ecosystem. But that's when you're starting to talk about, how am I going to handle this? It's not the API portal alone, but you've got to look at the infrastructure, you look at the security, you've got to look at everything. And so your whole approach to the problem changes, right? And that's where you start looking at API as a product, because a product could be something that everyone could use over time, and it's got to have a life cycle, and the way that you work with various developers could also change.
Yeah, so that, I would say that reflects what I'm seeing is enterprises wanting to get a more well-known common API lifecycle across groups. So that's something that's repeatable. Teams are kind of on the same page, using the same vocabulary, tooling, contract driven, Swagger, Open API, but it's still, and most times, like even the ones that are moving to design first or any more advanced concepts, you say, getting business stakeholders involved, they don't speak Swagger or Open API. They don't speak JSON schema for modeling. So how do you make this more inclusive to these business stakeholders?
Yeah. So I say you're never going to be lucky having business people who speak technical jargon. So I've been lucky that wherever I worked, we've had like technical PMs, everyone is technical. But I've been also with teams where you really do not understand the language and speak the language. And I think that's where you got to work as a triad, because you need your counterpart from engineering, as well as you need the equivalent on the product or business side, because then you're talking, even if you're trying to draw up a contract, which is whether you use Swagger or anything, irrespective of the tooling, you're speaking both languages there. And I think I've like worked with teams where both parties, so that's my team as well as the third party developer, we ensure that our calls do have product as well as engineering, so we are able to throw in different ideas or different perspectives from both sides, and you're getting
Yeah.
everyone's opinion at the end of the day. So it's more agile. We try to do it more agile as well, so you keep these conversations going, and the product team can always step in, while the engineering team is also helping business understand what is it that you're trying to achieve with these endpoints, right? So
Yeah.
it's not just, you're not just heavily IT driven or business driven at one point in time.
Yeah, and I think the more we expose business stakeholders to this processes, give them a voice in it, give them a seat at the table. Hopefully, those are diverse voices. Those aren't just people who are in alignment with IT or
Yes.
just white male. I would even throw out that we want to make sure it's a diverse set of stakeholders at the table
Stakeholders.
early on, be part of that feedback loop internally. But then once it's opened up to consumers, that feedback loop extends the same way to consumers, and you're gathering feedback, and that's all a well thought out process.
Yeah. And I think that involvement of stakeholders needs to start early, because at every point in time, you would need the relevant stakeholders. I'm not saying that you need to bring everyone in this journey, but I think when you start off, you might need a particular set of stakeholders. Maybe midway through, you'll need a different bunch, right? So I think sometimes I've noticed where we involve different stakeholders too late in the piece. So that is also a problem. It's like, try to come out with your who your stakeholders are right in the beginning, and figure out who is it do I need to consult or inform or work very closely with. When you draw out that, you're obviously going to be bringing in the diversity that we spoke about. You're going to be more conscious who is going to be involved at what point in time, and then you'll ensure that you've got not just different disciplines, but yeah, talking about uh, you know diversity and inclusion. That's always challenging, but I think you need to take that effort early, rather than just to tick in the box last at the very end to say, hey, I've done my job.
Hmm. Hmm. Agreed. And I'm seeing a wider group of people involved. I mean, we have QA, we have security folks, we have so it's definitely getting to be a more a larger group of stakeholders who are at the table, and depending on whether it's public or partner, or those things come in there. But I'm really seeing the there's kind of a shift in power that I've seen since the SOA day. So I'm an old database guy, so
Hmm.
COBOL databases to Fox Pro to SQL Server, Microsoft, and that was my progression through the 80s and 90s. I'm dating myself now, but um, the database is always a power center in the enterprise, and
Yes.
what lit me up about APIs was web services were exciting and interesting, but it was once
Hmm.
you started seeing that usage of web APIs of HTTP, and they weren't really good APIs. They weren't like, the best designed but they
Hmm.
were scrappy web APIs out of social companies, and what Salesforce did and Amazon and
Yeah.
eBay and all of these like caught my attention, but it was exposing holes in this power center that was the database. And I feel like now it's kind of becoming the gateway as well. The API gateway is taking over as this kind of power center where the value is transmitted or transacted. And are you seeing, when it comes to the gateways and API management, are you seeing a centralized, or are you seeing a more federated, multiple kind of gateway approach across these teams and stakeholders?
No, I think once again, I'd say it goes back to the maturity because I've been in teams where you started on a very small scale. You do not want to, invest in, API management solutions. You start building out your small mini gateways internally, and you're just trying out all that. Whereas there are organizations where they have like a very big ecosystem, and so that's when the federated and everything else falls in. So it's going to be a mix, I'd say, but I wouldn't say I've seen a pattern. But I think the more mature you are, you would start understanding the value in having taking a federated approach, having an API management solution, a portal, the gateway. You start seeing through what benefits you're getting from a security point of view. You're also starting to see from an end user point of view, what is it that you're giving the user being your partner or developer as well here. So you're changing the whole scene here, because I think that's where I do not see companies or organizations, investing a lot in these solutions, because they're not seeing the big picture or the value that your partners would get. And that's when you do not, like I worked with teams which just went on without any API portals for a long time. Okay, so and that's hard. It gets to a point where you're trying to actually do everything in-house, and then you're starting to see a massive interest in these endpoints and APIs that you've built, and then you're just going back, trying to then start thinking about what is it that I can do if with my current system, do I need to start investing? So I think it depends on the maturity. I don't know. What would you say? Is there a pattern now that you've spoken about the world of databases that you've worked in? Like you would have seen, I'm sure you may have seen a different trend
Yeah,
with different types of organizations.
I mean, and there's a couple things in what you just said. I would say are fairly common to what I'm seeing, but I want to make sure I got it right. So you're saying there has to be this kind of consumer balance to what's happening via the portal and via these API management to offset the kind of producer, like you have to invest in a portal and become more mature and have up to date docs and have a feedback loop with your consumers and keep them up to date and have a balance with the consumer side of things. Otherwise, it won't work. Was that kind of what you were saying in there?
I'm saying have a balance. You're partially right. Have a balance, but I'm not saying invest, because when you're still trying out, when you're starting, you definitely wouldn't want, business would never invest in, an API management solution or a portal, or investing, with great docs and all that. But give a thought to it, because you're now, you'll probably want, it's like a black box that you're working with. So think from a developer end user point of view. How is it that you can, give them the docs, give them the logs, give them the keys, the tokens, everything without the solution, right?
Hmm.
Because if you do not think, you are going to bump into problems, especially where I worked with teams which are, risk and compliance driven. You've got to think, because you're not investing in these solutions early days when you're experimenting. So the balance has to be there, but you do not have to do it with sophisticated tools right from the beginning, but a thought has to be given. Once you've got to a stage where you've done your POCs and everything, you know that this is definitely got a value prop to it, you definitely need to start thinking about what would
Hmm.
happen in few years' time. So I think that's where, going back to our
Yeah.
first point, getting your architect, your engineering team and product is key, because what could start as a one day, Friday project could end up changing your
Yeah.
whole API scene.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I would say, back to what I was saying as far as like some of the common aspects of what you're saying, what I see is even I see people who don't have a portal. I see the whole mix at API early, as we would call them, in the journey. And then once they start becoming more API aware, they hopefully have a strategy in place, as you said, and then they start investing in more tooling. But even the ones who have a portal, public or privately, there's, back to the zombie API portal. It's not always up to date. The most common thing I'm seeing is it just doesn't keep pace with the pace of change within the enterprise, or there's no incentive for people to publish metadata about APIs to make it accessible. And so I was just writing a list from this week of other conversations I had where people were asking, well, we just want our gateway logs to tell us what APIs all exist out there and give us an accurate snapshot because we don't know.
Yeah. I would say sometimes the composition of our teams is a problem, and I can see some data-driven companies doing this differently. I think it starts with us, because we've got to start thinking how we can leverage off the data that we are collecting. Because then you'll flip the coin and say, okay, this is something that your external developers would need to. So when I mentioned about composition, sometimes you need a data analyst or someone sit in the team if your product person or anyone else who's wearing a different hat in the team is not able to think about that, because sometimes we slip, right? We've got to start thinking about how is this data going to be of value to our partners and our ecosystem, because we all know APIs are a black box. It's there. It's very easy to use, but beneath it, they don't know how we implement it. But there's a lot that we need to do, and the only common language that we speak between these two different types of software, if I may say, is this API language, and all that we can get out of it is the logs. But if you're not thinking about what is it that the logs are giving, it's ultimately data. We then start to take a step back and see that right throughout the development phase, how is it that we're going to start using the data? So sometimes when I work with my teams, what I tend to do, and this happens very, very much in the finance industry, is we definitely need to audit and keep track of the data that we have, because of the security and various compliance standards that are in place. And so for us, we start looking at, data governance, data controls, everything. And so we start looking at what is it that is there in the logs, those conversations start happening with our partners too. That's actually our starting point for any conversation that we have, is data for us, because for fintech, you can't, there is never a second chance. What happens if you lose, you start divulging all your, sensitive data, right? What happens if your logs are going to have all this data? So those conversations happen early, depending on the industry. Some industries where data isn't as sensitive as, say, fintech, I've seen that they're more lax. They're not as concerned, and so it's typically the example that you mentioned. It just sits there, doing nothing.
So shifting gears to the financial space and the role of, I would say, fintech and APIs and kind of changing this monolithic industry. And so what are the real, like, honest, no BS motivations of the C-suite for a financial company, a large bank, an HSBC, to go API first, to make API change? Is it a regulatory argument? Is it a competitive, profit driven? Like, what's truly going to motivate them to do APIs well?
I think it's the security risk that comes with it, and the standards that are put that they'll have to adhere to, which come from different regulatory bodies. I think it's mainly compliance, which is why I think there is, they've started, but there's hesitancy. and I think different countries are mature in its own different ways. But I think
Yeah.
the pattern across all is you've got various standards set by different regulatory bodies, which means, okay, they'll start setting, the information has to be encrypted. You can't send this type of a field. You've got to, um, removed certain fields which cannot be exposed, and then that changes the whole product and business conversation because a use case is invalid if you do not send this information. Why aren't you sending this information? That information is too sensitive because this regulatory body has a problem sending it. And I think that's the problem, fundamental problem, because you can't have one set standard, but you have different standards that you need to adhere to, and there's that continual check that you need to do, which slows us down a lot in fintech. But that being said, we can't get away with it. So steps are being taken, controls are being put in place, standards are being set. But I think it is slow. We are getting there, but I think it is very slow. It will be long past before we call, I think that category of companies would call themselves as API first, mainly because of the regulations and the compliance that they'll have to adhere to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to watch European regulation kind of set the tone and then have it kind of echo out across the world. So Hong Kong, Australia, Brazil, like
Yeah,
others are emulating it. I think the
yeah,
US is doing its best job to act like it might be, could be, should be, but then we're not. So like we're doing regulatory theater, I think, right now when it comes to it. But it's interesting to watch how each country or region kind of pays
yeah.
attention and starts doing things.
I'll definitely agree there. I was lucky enough to, work across different countries, and I've also got a chance, work with a few folks from Hong Kong, and I noticed the pattern there. They are running at a faster pace than certain other countries. I don't know whether there's uh, I don't know whether the regulatory bodies are more stringent in trying to get things done quickly. And because sometimes I've noticed for Australia, I think the places that I've worked with, we do have set standards, but sometimes you get caught up in the process, and that's what takes us time. Okay, so it's a combination of different factors. It's probably in the US. It must be a different game. I'd probably like to hear what is the reason that you see the US different from other countries. Is it that you do have more stringent requirements? Is it the complexity in the fintech world? What would you say is the reason?
It's ideology. It's how America views regulations. So it's if you're I mean, and the conservative view of regulations in it, it's
Mm,
a bad thing, and that's the
yeah,
default stance is regulations are bad. But if you at all work with business, like regulations are good, and regulation and a lot of enterprise organizations depend on regulations propping up their industries,
exactly.
and there's regulations comes in a lot of shapes and sizes,
Yeah.
and then there's the privacy aspect of regulations. So GDPR and CCPA, California is leading that. So there's the interoperability and standards and reuse part of regulation. There's the privacy, and then there's the I would call it the automation of regulation or deregulation. Is like I worked on regulations.gov for the U.S.
Hmm.
government, and so it's
Hmm.
how do you automate the informing and reporting of regulations so it's automated using APIs. So those are the
Yeah.
three spheres that I see regulation playing out, and
Hmm.
the US is just unique in our view. Well, maybe not unique, but we're special in our view of hating regulations and just believing it's bad. But it's kind of theater. It's not real. I don't know. It's weird.
So on that, I'd like to understand from the stakeholder point of view, going back to where we started, we were talking about APIs being IT driven. What would the balance be like?
Yeah,
Talking about the
good question.
still in the fintech space.
Yeah. I mean, my view of APIs, and this isn't limited to financial, is it's a Venn diagram of three circles: the technology of APIs, the business of APIs and then the politics of APIs. And like, I don't care how good your API design is, hypermedia, perfect, whatever. If you don't have a business model,
Mm-hmm.
if you can't pay for it, like, it doesn't matter. And then I don't care how much money you're making or whatever. Like, I've seen, like the Twitter API has been the
Yeah.
politics of it and rate limits. Um, Facebook being investigated by the FTC right now for, anti-competitive practices in their ecosystem, because once they bought Instagram, they started throttling and giving elevated error rates to the other image applications via their
Mm-hmm.
API. And so you start seeing those games playing. And so when it
Yeah.
comes to financial, like, you see it with PSD2 rollout is,
Yeah.
well, hey, yeah, we're PSD2 compliant, but you can't find the documentation or figure out how to
Station.
onboard. It's like, really weird things like that. So it's like and I say politics, but it's the games people play, because I,
Yeah.
I saw the potential of APIs early on, and a lot of people say, yeah, we like APIs and we like interoperability. But the first lesson I learned is, no, not everyone actually truly wants interoperability, and they want lock-in. And so it's an interesting game to try to understand.
So, if when you say not everyone likes it, what is the fundamental reason? Is it like a lack of knowledge on the potential that APIs bring, or is it like, um, we're not looking at, the short term and the long term? We're just looking caught up with the problem and not seeing the future in it. What would you say is the reason?
I mean, I would say D, all the above across that, but I would say first and foremost, people don't understand. A lot of people just think, oh, if it's a public API, making it publicly available, I'm giving something away. I'm giving away, unfettered access to all my digital resources and capabilities. But then in the same motion, the same companies will be like, well, we don't have any public APIs because of this reason. And then I can proxy and show them a list of all the APIs behind their mobile applications and web applications and everything. And they think those are somehow private APIs, and they don't understand the mechanisms of API management,
Hmm.
and a known life cycle, and a kind of producer consumer relationship, and the value of feedback loops, how much control you have over authentication and access control. And they don't understand all of that. So you see it as back to the database to gateway analogy that I said earlier, is this shift in power.
Yeah.
They see gateways as a threat. They're giving away something, or they're
Yeah.
getting it. They're not going to make money off of it, and they don't see the potential. So
Is there something that um, technical teams or engineering teams could do, or would you say it's the composition of the teams that is adding to the problem? Should we have like a balance to, like, how do we get about um getting this knowledge out there,
yeah, I mean,
right? That's
it
our challenge.
yeah, it depends on the culture. It depends on the organization, the industry, how much lock in there is, how much it just really depends. Because some industries I've seen top down CIO saying, hey, do API first. Here's all the learning, the knowledge, the education you need, the tools. We're going to enable you to do the right thing. And that just works. And then I've seen that happen. And then everyone on the ground floor go, no way, we're not doing that. That's dumb, that we're not going to do APIs. But then I've seen amazing bottom up, organic, engineer led, champions going, hey, let's get a API lifecycle that's known. Let's, advocate and evangelize. Let's start a center of excellence, and let's come up with standards, and all use the same version of Open API instead of Swagger, and, have contracts and share tests and have hackathons and stuff like that. So it's a mix. But it takes evangelists. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm the API evangelist. I'm the chief evangelist. It takes evangelizing. That's my belief system. So
Yes. And would you say to your role that it should start, would you advise starting, say, internally? Because sometimes I've noticed that you're talking about internal APIs and some teams are great at it, but some teams aren't even aware that we should be thinking about APIs for everything,
Yeah.
right? So where would, as an evangelist, what would you do to say ensure that it starts first with our own team, our own company?
Yeah. Yeah, start internal, start small, start get little wins. But it can API first for me isn't just about producing APIs, it's about consuming APIs. And one easy one there is before you buy any new software or anything, you make sure it has an API first, and then use that API to automate and make sure you're not locked into that vendor. That's like a
Yeah,
business
yeah,
level API first capability. But yeah, start internally, start small because like the ugliest messes I've ever seen are companies who haven't really dealt with all their internal baggage and politics and drama and then
yeah,
start opening up public APIs and kind of
yeah,
open up the curtain to, to the audience a little bit more faster than it probably should be, and they weren't quite ready, and that can hurt, that can make,
yes,
scare people away from doing it anymore. So you got to be careful.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That becomes a problem. I've been with teams uh, where you end up in situations like that, and the example where I mentioned saying that I had like a situation where our partners exploded with the in terms of numbers. That's where I see there's a fundamental problem where it should have started internally before it actually you start thinking of exposing publicly. But something that I wanted to go back to another question that you spoke about. You mentioned one of the problems as discoverability.
Yeah, nobody knows where their APIs are. I don't care who you are.
Exactly.
Every enterprise organization, every startup, like nobody knows where all their APIs are. And I mean, I've done all day consultant session with the Internal Revenue Service in the United States, the IRS, and about their internal API strategy. Nothing to do with their public. And they
Mm-hmm.
don't know where any of their APIs are. They admittedly have problems with hoarding. So
Mm-hmm.
I another project I worked on. So this is very common in federal agencies. I worked for the Obama administration, going around to
Mm-hmm.
federal agencies, getting them to open up their public data assets in a machine readable way.
Mm-hmm.
That was the mandate that I
Mm-hmm.
worked on, and I was at the VA doing web service inventory. So finding WSDLs is all, like what I did like 4 days out of the week. Where are the WSDLs? And so you go around the Department of Veterans Affairs looking for WSDLs, and
Mm-hmm.
who's got all the no one knows where WSDLs are
Where
except
the
for
whistles are.
Deloitte, the Deloitte staffer. Like all the contracting firms know where the WSDLs are, and they have like a catalog and know
Mm-hmm.
where, because so it's hoarding, it's digital
Yeah.
hoarding, and you see that in web service environments within large
Yeah.
enterprise organizations where budgets are associated with. In the VA, like if you have the authoritative record for the veteran, you're given a lion's share of
Mm-hmm.
the budget. So of course, everyone's has an authoritative record for the veteran, because everyone, and then so everyone kind of defends their world like that. So access to data, there's just a lot of illnesses that exist across organizations. So, and then some, there's organizations who don't have these illnesses. I've seen groups, I've had conversations where they, 100-year-old company modernizes
Mm-hmm.
their legacy infrastructure within like 5 years, and they're running in the cloud, and they're elastic, and they're API first. They still have issues, but they don't have all those that legacy baggage. So
Okay. So, what would you say is the problem? Is it that teams, product and engineering teams, need to think about, say, maintenance as part of our, we're done with our product development. That's it. All you're referring product as APIs. But are you thinking that we should be looking at maintenance as well, where you spoke about hoarding? Is it like an accumulation due to legacy stuff, or is it something that is just done without putting too much thought into it? And we have never been looking at it as, a cleanup work or tech debt or anything. Is that the reason? Is it that you've written your API, it's Visuals, you've done everything and done, handover, finish, but we never go back and look at it as a
Yeah.
part of, the maintenance phase.
Yeah. Interesting question. There's a lot going on in there that are, I would say, that project based mentality that we talked about earlier,
Yeah,
checkbox done. That's why the people who did the projects or had the contracts know where the whistles
yeah,
are. Um, and so there's a whole mix, but I would say we have a lot of unhealthy relationships with legacy technology in the space
mm,
where, and not all legacy is bad. And if you think
yeah,
about the kind of the notion of the word legacy, like legacy
yeah,
doesn't always mean bad. Like your
yeah,
legacy on this earth or whatever, there's a lot of,
yeah,
and so like when you have, if you work in an organization, you do the legacy work, it's not as cool, it's not as sexy, it doesn't get as much budget. You want to do the front, there's something
yeah,
about that, but some of these systems don't need to go away. Some of them need to go away. And that process just needs to be healthier and more balanced, and and have these feedback loops and these cycles, because sometimes this stuff is important. Legacy is meaningful and we should keep it around and it works. I mean, if you look at like the unemployment system in the US when COVID hit,
mm,
they had a big, oh no, what are we going to do? Like this is all written in COBOL and uses, IBM mainframes. And they
mm,
just ended up training a bunch of young kids on how to do IBM mainframes in COBOL rather than like rewriting it in Node.js and
yeah.
microservices, because it's what needed to happen. So I think there's a lot of unhealthy views of how and why we do technology, and it's just all in this big ball of yarn that we call
All
the
right.
enterprise.
On that note, I think I'd like to take it really tactical. What do you think we should do? Should it start right at the bottom from the engineers where we build up a backlog of all this work and say, start from there? Or should it be from the top where we need to start educating everyone as to it's not a handover, it's not a project, because it ultimately goes down to your API strategy, or should it start from the bottom?
I mean, it's depends and it's both, but I would say leadership has to, especially in large enterprise organizations and government agencies and higher ed institutions, they have to think longer term. And I think there's competing incentive models and reward systems in place within enterprises that reward short-term thinking at leadership levels that aren't always in alignment with the business
Mm,
or the industry or what's needed. And that, I think that's why you end up with this ball of yarn that's twisted, because of
twisted.
that imbalance that exists. And so you got to have longer term thinking. And back to the government example, like when I worked in the government, people ask me, well, are you uh, government? Are you G person? Are you staff, or are you contractor, or are you like a political staffer? Because if you're a political
Mm,
staffer, you're there like 2 years or 4 years. If you're a government employee, you're there longer. If you're a
mm,
contractor, you're there for a fixed period of time and then you're gone. And there's not a lot of knowledge transfer, capacity transfer. You're there one day and you're gone.
mm,
And I mean, I saw whole wings of offices just gone one day and empty for like a week and then filled with new bodies. And so this this kind of long-term capacity
mm.
and in capacity building internally, like who knows how these services work? They're not documented. They're
Yeah,
WSDLs. How do you find them? How do you sniff them out? How do you understand how this works? It's working and it supports all these systems. How do we not break that? There's just a lot of knowledge that needs to be shared, and it's not always um, properly incentivized to be shared, I guess. So it's got to start top down and have that long term thinking, or build a system for short term thinking. If you're just a pump and dump scheme for a stock,
yeah,
like build APIs
yeah,
and do it appropriately, so
yeah. It just comes down to, what is it that is really the vision for your company, and I think that would dictate what the strategy is and the ways of working with
yeah,
APIs, right? Yeah.
yeah.
Otherwise,
But
you just go down the project route.
yeah, And so strategy, you kept saying it, it's got to be done strategically. It's got to be done more honestly. I don't think there's a lot
Yeah.
of honesty in the API lifecycle in some organizations. In others, there's a lot, and it pays off. Um, well, we're at 45 minutes, so this is much longer than most of the podcasts go. But it's been great having you ask me questions because I like somewhere around about 26, 27 minutes. It's you started slowly asking me all the questions, and that's funny. I like that. It's great. Thank you.
No, it is nice chatting with you because you've got like a wealth of knowledge behind, and it's a nice combination because I come with product and engineering, whereas there
Yeah.
you're the evangelist. So it's good to get, different opinions.
Yeah, no, I sat down, I was telling Latroy, my show partner in crime here, this weekend I had the first time to kind of sit down and absorb all these conversations I'm having across breaking changes. And then I have like 4 or 5 breaking changes episodes a week that I'm recording, kind of building out an inventory. I have 4 or 5
Hmm.
enterprise customer conversations with as part of my job. And just every week, I just these conversations have I learned so much, and I don't always have time to like absorb it. And so going
Yeah.
back and breaking this is a great thing about breaking changes is these are recorded. There's a show transcript, and then I'm able to go back and like reread it. I write a blog post when it comes out, so I do have that time to absorb it and my conversations with amazing smart people like you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, this has been great. Thanks for coming and this has been good. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Likewise, thanks.
Thanks again to Rosemary for stopping by. For more about Rosemary, you can find her on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to the Breaking Changes podcast at postman.com/events/breaking-changes. I'm your host, Kin Lane, and until next time, cheers.